All right. This talk is called Unpacking Colonial Histories and Aztec Dance. And I'm in Dallas. Just wanted to say hi to everyone here, kind of from our local chapter. I'm going to go ahead and get started here. Exasperated, the Franciscan Fray Bernardino de Sahagún remarked on his efforts at converting the indigenous people of Mexico in the early 1500s, quote, even after having preached to them for more than 50 years, if they were now left by themselves, I believe that in fewer than 50 years, there would be no trace left of the preaching they received. Given his observations about the resiliency of indigenous cultures and traditions, Fray Bernardino de Sahagún would likely not be all too surprised to learn of the continuing importance of Mesoamerican indigenous spirituality in the 21st century. Yet Aztec dance in its current form would no doubt be unrecognizable to him and the indigenous Nahua scribes who meticulously documented the Mexica culture in the Florentine Codex, which is the series of books that he oversaw the production of. Today, Aztec dancers perform in communities across the United States, Canada, and Mexico, and draw connections back to the Mexica tribe that was largely decimated in 1521. At the same time, substantial evidence also points to the role of Mexican nationalist projects in the 20th century, including the Ballet Folklorico and the Indigenismo movement that further centered the Aztec as a national ancestor. How might these claims of historicism be contextualized against this modern backdrop? And how should we balance community assertions of antiquity with academic analyses that frequently categorize all of Aztec dance as invented tradition? In her 1980 study of Falasha liturgy, Kay Chalamet suggests that ethnomusicology can, quote, move beyond corroboration of established historical theory and provide the basis for new and alternative explanations. I suggest that such alternative explanations for the broad appeal of Aztec dance to participants who are not of Nahua descent can be found through revisiting colonial history, in addition to the more widely considered national history that has been more heavily centered in most analyses. This deeper reading suggests that colonial era processes that have long been glossed as syncretic and a fusion of Spanish and indigenous practices warrant reconsideration. In particular, I suggest the need to take into account the intercultural exchanges between indigenous communities that cannot be neatly parsed into binaries of colonized and colonizer. What can be gleaned by considering the colonial era cultural exchanges between indigenous communities? So I just wanted to share here, we have dancers from the San Jose Mexica New Year, and then Amalia Hernandez's Ballet Folklorico, that's kind of part of that nationalist movement, and then Fray Bernardino de Sahagún, who was really documenting a lot of kind of Aztec and indigenous culture in the 1500s. In particular, in this analysis, I suggest that we need to reconsider the influence of Nahuatl speakers from central Mexico, which is a language family from, as you can see, kind of around the central part of Mexico that include the Mexica, but also many other neighboring communities in the early colonial era. So you can see here we have Mexico Tenochtitlan, which was the capital of the Mexica, and then you can see the Tlaxcaltecas, that blob there that was not actually ever part of the Aztec Empire but remained independent. Okay. So I want to start with a quote by Guillermo Bonfils Batalla that says, the so-called syncretism may be understood not as an indiscriminate amalgam of elements from different backgrounds, a sort of devotional collage, but rather as the product of a complex process of appropriation. Diverse indigenous societies, or Indian societies, have taken the signs, symbols, and practices of the imposed religion and made them their own by reorganizing, reinterpreting them within the core of their religious beliefs. Cultural syncretism, or the idea of cultural mixture, has provided a theoretical cornerstone for Mexican nation-building projects. Yet, as Batalla points out, while colonizers certainly exerted significant influence, it is only in the last few decades that indigenous agency within these interactions has begun to receive equal attention. Furthermore, as has been commented by historians, anthropologists, and musicologists alike, syncretism and the related concepts of hybridity and creolization problematically suggest that a pure culture exists from which such syncretism takes place. So in this presentation, I map the spread of Nahua-centric cultural frameworks across the growing Spanish colony that challenge many of these ideas. I consider how the theorizing of colonial era culture through the lens of Spanish indigenous cultural syncretism has resulted in the overstating of Spanish and Catholic influences and the subsequent minimizing of critical interactions between indigenous communities, including Nahua-speaking peoples. I suggest that this overstatement has obscured rich pan-indigenous cultural exchanges that unfolded through the Spanish colonies and that continue to undergird contemporary Aztec dance as culturally relevant to those of ethnicities outside of the boundaries of the historical Aztec Empire. One of the central critiques of those who focus on only the 20th century in their analyses, particularly people pointing to mentioned tradition and ethnicity, pointing to why people who are not from those former borders that were the Aztec Empire and that kind of fit with that Nahua language, why they actually perform this, something that's meaningful to them. And I suggest that with a deeper look, this pan-indigenous Nahua-centric framework of Aztec dance is not a new phenomenon, but rather one that traces its roots all the way back to the first encounters between Nahua and Spanish. All right. So next slide here, a little history. While there's not time here to deliver the full description of the colonial history, there are some fundamentals that are important to understand in order to explain the centrality of the Aztec today and to identify Nahua influences. So in 1519, Hernan Cortez first arrived in Tenochtitlan, the home city of the Mexica tribe that ruled the Aztec Empire as a part of the Triple Alliance. After some cultural exchanges and many violent encounters, in August 1521, the Spanish decimated the city alongside their indigenous allies, many of whom saw advantages to unseating the Mexica. Many of these allies, including the Tlaxcalans, who lived near the Mexica, were themselves Nahua-speaking communities. This event marks an official end to the pre-Columbian era, but the reality is that breaks are rarely so clean in historical events. In fact, as James Lockhart notes, and he's a big scholar of the colonial era, particularly in Mexico and of Nahua, many colonial era indigenous sources suggest that the arrival of the Spanish did not signal an immediate change for a significant number of indigenous communities, particularly in rural areas where community structures and traditions continued largely as they had before. And this image here with Cortez meeting Montezuma is from the Florentine Codex. So that's the book that Bernardino de Sahagún wrote. While the conversion of indigenous people began with Cortez's invasion, it rapidly accelerated in the years following the fall of Tenochtitlan. Music schools and other sources of training emerged that particularly catered to the Nahua elite. The emerging class of Nahua elites that were trained in schools such as Pedro Elegante's music schools and others shortly established thereafter gained a special status as cultural interlocutors. They interpreted, wrote, and translated Catholic evangelizing materials through their Nahua cultural framework. As noted by historian and Nahua language specialist Louise Burkhart, their positions permitted a reorientation of Catholicism to encompass a Nahua-centric interpretation of Christianity. While these frameworks have been examined in detail in conversion theater pieces, how did they impact music and dance? Burkhart suggests that both the Nahua and Spanish frequently misconstructed each other as a result of assuming equivalencies that did not exist. So remarking on the consequences, Burkhart finds that, quote, mutual misconstructions of the other became institutionalized in a manner that perpetuated the cultural differences while promoting the illusion of sameness. These cultural misconstructions provided narrow yet significant arenas of latitude in colonial era dance performance, as well as music. The diversity of colonial era dance and music suggests that while the Spanish exerted significant influence, they did not necessarily supplant dances or their meanings. Nahua and Spanish music and dance could continue in parallel with each other through misconstructions and parallel modes that were coherent together. Within this framework, Nahua communities can interpret Spanish dances like the then popular Moros y Cristianos, which is a danza de conquista, from their own vantage point. Similarly, there was substantial latitude in how indigenous dances, such as the Nahua mitote, could be presented and Christianized. So shortly after the fall of Tenochtitlan, the Spanish immediately began expanding their holdings, rapidly eyeing new potential resource-rich regions. The Christianized Nahua moved alongside them, encountering new indigenous peoples along the way, and Christianizing them not with a purely European Catholicism, but one that had already been interpreted through a Nahua lens. As the Spanish and Nahua allies moved north into the American Southwest, Nahua culture and dances became the basis for new analogies. As they traveled, the Spanish, Nahua, and other indigenous allies encountered indigenous cultures distinct from their own. And during these encounters, terms like mitote, which comes from Nahua mitotia, to dance, were expanded, moving away from their designating a particular dance form, which they had previously in a number of cases, but rather just meaning any form of indigenous dance. And to this day, metote is still the word that's used in many areas outside of Nahua territories. So, for example, the Nayeri people from the northwestern corner of Mexico today, who are also known as the Cora, continue to practice metotes as a part of their agricultural calendar, so showing this lasting impact of this Nahua culture exchange. So this points to the Nahua influences in disseminating Catholicism through a Nahua-centric framework. So whether it was Nahua priests like Antonio de Ricon de Texcoco, who drafted grammars and proselytized Catholicism, performances of danzas de conquista with representations of Moctezuma and La Malinche on the banks of the Rio Grande, or enactments of the conquest by Pedro de Alvarado and Tlaxcalans in danzas de conquista that took place in Oaxaca and Guatemala, Nahua culture and histories intermingled with Catholicism as it was passed on to newly colonized indigenous people. And I just wanted to show some examples here. So you can see the Biombo folding screen. This is a piece that is at LACMA and is quite famous and well known. So it's from 1690, and it's a depiction of what is believed to be a metote that kind of fits a lot of that the Nahua descriptions by people like Bernardino de Sahagún of what he was seeing. And you can see the person in the red with the more extravagant feathers is depicting actually Moctezuma, who is conflated with Christ. And so even up into the Pueblo region of New Mexico, there's actually that conflation that exists with Moctezuma actually kind of having that representation. So you can see that continuing influence there. Another one that's really interesting is this, you can see the mural of the Santa Cruz of Querétaro. So this is Santiago descending from the sky with the cross. And this actually fits in with the myth, or one of the foundational myths or stories that go with the founding of Danza Azteca, or its predecessor Conchero, which is that and at this battle, basically the indigenous people accepted Catholicism and the cross, and then began to dance there and carry on the tradition. So Querétaro remains a really important city for Conchero and for Danza Azteca. All right, let's see. So Nahua culture and histories intermingle with Catholicism as it was passed on to newly colonized indigenous people. The distribution of Nahua-sized Catholicism to indigenous people was no accident. The Spanish intended to evangelize without necessarily Hispanicizing indigenous people to maintain social hierarchies. To this end, Nahuatl was even declared an official language for all indigenous people in New Spain in 1572. So they really kind of sought to use that core model as something to become a unifier across all of indigenous Mexico, but to maintain a very marked hierarchy between the Spanish colonizers and then the indigenous inhabitants. So what does this mean for consequences for the present day? So how should we look at and analyze Nahua culture and practices like contemporary Aztec dance within this historical context? And I suggest there are several lessons that can be drawn about hybridity and the importance of historical context for music research in the Americas by looking at this kind of more historical context. So first, and returning to Aztec dancing, I suggest that within these layers of histories lie several key alternative explanations for its current appeal. While a surface level glance suggests that much of this appeal appears to be a product of 20th century Mexican nationalism, and many people have pointed to the Ballet Folklorico, and I'm in no means, I do not mean to deny its importance as well, but a deeper look elucidates the way in which Nahua cultural dissemination predates nationalist movements. So once again, this is not to deny the importance of nationalism as kind of creating this important idea of who the Aztec were, but instead to acknowledge the deeper colonial layers that enable Nahua-centric nationalism to emerge in the 20th century and that rendered it meaningful and that continue to make it meaningful. Furthermore, these colonial histories reveal that Nahua culture, particularly Nahua-sized Catholicism, was often one and the same as colonial culture in New Spain for the cultures that were folded into a growing colony. And this points to the central paradox in Nahua culture in its potential for both decolonizing and homogenizing. Because we can see when we start to unpack this history that it's long been used both ways. And there are actually, like, we're even doing conversion theater plays for people in Oaxaca, for instance, for Mixtec and Zapotec audiences who did not understand Nahua, and they were performing them in Nahua for them. So this language factor is also very important. And Nahua culture is indisputably indigenous to the Americas, but at the same time, Nahua people and culture were also deeply embedded in these colonial endeavors, and therefore other in relation to many local indigenous cultures they interacted with during the colonial era, positioning them as kind of an in-between place where they were, in some cases, both colonized, but also in many cases acting on the behalf of colonizers, or in some cases colonizers themselves. Because if you go up to Tlaxcala, for instance, or sorry, if you go up to the north in like Zacatecas, some of the first colonies that were founded in 1591 were Tlaxcalans, and they brought with them their music and culture as well. And third, unpacking these layers of colonial history in music and dance reveal how models centered on Spanish indigenous syncretism or hybridity have obscured the rich cultural exchanges between indigenous peoples. In particular, this binary cultural model has masked many local indigenous practices and the critical role of Nahua interlocutors who carried the histories of Moctezuma, Cortez, and La Malinche with them across the colonies, further lodging Tenochtitlan in the Valley of Mexico as the geographic and cultural heart of New Spain. Yet what, for instance, Malinche as a figure means to the Cora and their mitotes as compared to the Otomi practicing Conchero can vary. Within these broader colonial frameworks, local customs and indigenous practices continued, embedding themselves within a Nahua-sized Catholic practices and cultural misconstructions. So, thank you.